Lloyd sat by the pool. He couldn't figure it out. At first glance, it all looked so normal. A shitty, mid-sized hotel pool. Nothing to see there. But once you added up the context, it didn't make sense. First of all, it was the end of March. Hardly a good time for a relaxing open-air swim. Second was the heat. There was no water heater, and no sign of one. So how could the pool still be so warm? And third and final, it was something a kid in the lobby said. "I want to play with the pool noodle," he'd called out to his mom, pulling at her hand. "I want to go back. I want to play with the pool noodle." There were no pool noodles. This place didn't have anything like that. Something wasn't adding up. Now, Lloyd had plans. He wasn't there to investigate a hunch. He was passing through on his way to the East Coast. He knew people there. Well, the previous him had known people there. The Lloyd, him, didn't know them. That was a whole other kind of wasp nest that he wasn't ready to dig into. He'd just have to flash the Galapagos name and hope for the best. But first, he wanted to know about this pool noodle thing. His years at Hatchet had taught him a couple of things. Don't trust traffic lights that stay red too long. Make note of unusual stop signs and their location. Be wary of unusual strangers. If you sense a particular smell of chlorine and ammonia upon entering a room, leave. These were hard-earned lessons from hundreds of reports over the past few years. But pool noodles, that was a new one. Lloyd could stay for a few days longer. That was no issue. He'd vetted the place and knew that Hatchet didn't have any direct control of the surrounding area. Sure, there were always a couple of people selling or using some product of theirs, but that was to be expected. Hatchet made components that fit with everything, and there was guaranteed to be an unmarked part or two around the hotel. He knew for sure they were in the security cameras, which is why he'd mapped them out and double-checked which were actually plugged in and which wasn't. He'd been thorough. There was a storage space that had been the first thing he checked. No pool noodles, no maintenance space with a water heater either. They didn't even cover the pool up at night, touting it as an open, around-the-clock space. Late March was no time to relax in a sun chair by the poolside, but Lloyd did it anyway. Not in a bathing suit, but still. He looked a bit out of place in his winter coat, all huddled up with a notebook. But there was no one there to see him anyway. There was no one using that pool, and there was definitely no one playing with pool noodles. He went over his notes. There had to be something to dig into. He'd found nothing out of place during his first safety check. There was no room with extra security measures, no mysterious locked doors, no unusually nosy bellhops, nothing like that. But maybe that was the issue. He'd been so busy looking for things that seemed out of place that he might have missed something that should be there. He tapped a drawn column named Cameras in his notebook, going over them one by one. Almost every major shared space in the hotel had one or several security cameras, all except the pool. That was curious. It gave Lloyd an uncomfortable suspicion. Perhaps there were people around that were somehow involved in whatever this was. If there was something at all, that is, but he was pretty sure there was. Being a trained Galapagos agent gives you a nose for this kind of thing. If the lack of poolside security cameras were not just a coincidence, it implied that some of the hotel staff, or possibly all of them, were compromised in one way or another. Going to bed that night, Lloyd couldn't help but think that he was overreacting. He should go on his way, leaving this to whoever was supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to intervene. He was completely off the rails. Was this the first sign of his paranoia taking over? There'd been times when he'd spent hours looking into something that had turned out to be a whole bag of nothing. Would this be another one of those times? He had a feeling the answer was no. But he couldn't know for sure. Not yet. Looking out his window, he could see the pool was still open at night. The lights were on, and there was steam rising from the hot water. It felt dumb to hyperfixate on this one thing, but it was the only thing that directly poked at his attention. Everything else was normal. There wasn't even a point to this. If the world was coming to an end, mysteries like this was to be expected. And yet, it felt important, like he was missing something. The next morning, after the breakfast buffet, Lloyd tried to strike up a casual conversation with one of the service staff. A man in his late 20s, with a blonde buzz cut. "I gotta say, it's unusual to have a round-the-clock pool like that," Lloyd said, grabbing another slice of rye bread. "Don't you need a lifeguard? Isn't that some kind of regulation?" "No worries, we have one," the man smiled. "He just stays out of the way." "Really? I haven't seen him." "That's sort of the point," the man chuckled. "Don't worry, it's perfectly safe. I swim there all the time." "Does the rest of the staff do that too?" The man paused, but his smile never faltered. "When it suits them," he said. "You'd have to ask around." Lloyd nodded. He intended to. He kept his eyes on the staff for a while. They didn't do anything out of the ordinary. If anything, they were perfectly pleasant. They would smile and wave, making sure not to get in his way. Lloyd had told them he was a travelling journalist, and that didn't seem to bother them in the slightest. If anything, they were excited about it. Later that night, Lloyd couldn't help but feel like an idiot. He'd been watching people swimming and laughing all day, like some kind of creep, all because of a single throwaway comment from a child. Yes, his gut told him there was something going on, but even if there was, what was his role in this? Was he supposed to fix every problem he came across? He decided he'd leave in the morning, cutting his stay short. The reception was open around the clock, so he might as well let them know ahead of time. He headed down to the lobby, passing the pool on the way. Lloyd stopped. Looking out, he could see a handful of staff members out for a swim. Except they weren't swimming. Most of them were just standing there, looking at one another in silence. Two of them looked like they were silently ballroom dancing. Lloyd rolled his eyes. Of course they had to be weird. Now there was no way he was letting this go. The next morning, he fired on all cylinders. He ran a check on ex-staff and looked into everything from health records to paid time off. Lloyd had plenty of ways to get hold of records that others might not, and he wasn't afraid to invade a little privacy every now and then. What would it matter if he found out someone had hemorrhoids or genital warts? He wasn't going to tell anyone, and he sure as hell wouldn't be calling Hatchet about it. Slowly but surely, a couple of patterns started to emerge. Some people with chronic or recurring issues stopped going to the doctor. Some of them had stopped taking pain medication. It all began a couple of months prior, but Lloyd couldn't find a specific date. He had an approximate month, but that was it. He had to dig deeper. There were a couple of incidents around that time. A violent storm had torn straight through a nearby community, bringing along debris all the way from the east coast. There was some piping trouble along the street from a series of flash floods. But most unusual was the restoration bill for the pool itself. It had sustained some damage in the storm, and as they fixed it up, they decided to give it the deluxe treatment. Heated ceramic tiles all along the edges, chlorine-free filters, the whole shebang. Something happened in that storm, and things changed. Lloyd pulled out his notebook, making a sort of mind board. One note for the storm, another note for the restoration, one for the staff. There had to be a pattern, and it all had to connect somehow. He added another note for the pool noodle. That part didn't make any sense. There was no point in lying about there being one, and it was the kind of thing you wouldn't bring to a hotel. So, what was it? What was it really? Note by note, Lloyd listed the things he'd read about, the many things he'd encountered, directly or otherwise. There were the rain drinkers, of course, but they didn't fit the bill. These people were out, no matter if it rained or not. Perhaps it was the result of a housekeeper. But that didn't explain the pool noodle. There'd been no cloud coverage, so it couldn't be a cloudfather. Something in Lloyd's head lit up like a Christmas tree. He tapped the storm note, the East Coast note, the pool restoration note. I know this, he mumbled. I've seen this. I know what this is. There'd been a similar case a couple of years prior. A high school kid reported on his whole class getting obsessed with a pool where something lived. Lloyd had only reviewed the case second-hand, but he remembered the details. They never sent people to deal with it on site, as the situation seemed to solve itself. But he remembered the conclusion they'd drawn. He'd signed off on it. He took one final note, adding it to his board. On it, he wrote, Martians. Back in his training days, Lloyd's handler had told him, it's smart to draw conclusions and dumb to make assumptions. Wisdom comes from discerning one from the other. That was something he'd taken to heart. Was this a conclusion or an assumption? It pointed to conclusion, but he needed proof. He had to devise some kind of test. He didn't know much about the Martians, but he knew they were clever. During the final collapse of their home system, they'd done as so many other species had done before them. They'd escaped. Most of them got lost in that timeless void between space and matter, losing themselves to a deathless nothing. Others would find something to guide them to new lands. Blue sunflowers, for example. The curious plant that somehow seemed to act as a lighthouse for things lost in the dark. The Martians that made it to Ao were curious creatures. On a time scale, they had arrived long before humanity did. But by the time they had adapted enough to our environment to walk the surface, millions of years had already passed. Now they were either stuck in isolated pockets of underground lakes or sticking to their own kind in niche corners of the ocean. But every now and then, one would find its way to people. It had happened at a vineyard in France, at that high school in Minnesota. Hell, there was probably one of those things at the bottom of Frog Lake, too. If there was one here at the hotel, it couldn't be far off. This presented a unique opportunity. Lloyd figured that if the creature was inside the actual hotel, the staff would be more careful about him skulking about. Since they didn't seem to care either way, he figured a creature might hide somewhere nearby. That meant the hotel, or the pool, led somewhere. Checking the permits filed during the restoration process, he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. That might mean there were unauthorized changes made, but that didn't make sense either. It would have been noticed by now. No, there had to be a different answer. Taking some time away from the hotel, Lloyd considered the nearby businesses. A corner shop, a barber, a travel agency, nothing unusual. The only thing that stood out was a spa. Depending on the type of spa, they might have a pool of their own. Looking a little closer at the maps filed to the records office, there was a single piece of connecting tissue between the hotel and the spa. These were the only two buildings on the street that had a connection to an underground bomb shelter. All the other stores and buildings had been modernized, and the connection was sealed off. So there was a defunct bomb shelter, somewhere underground. This was all coming together. Lloyd had a cigarette as he walked around the hotel. He was still getting used to smoking, but there was no point quitting now. Leaving Hatchet had turned his life upside down, and it wasn't about to get normal anytime soon. The deals he'd made, the sacrifices, He didn't even have his own body anymore. He was still getting used to seeing it in the mirror. What could be normal for a guy like him? He couldn't fathom the circumstances that would put him in a position to have a wife and kid. Would the kid look like him? Or Lloyd him? He couldn't help but wonder if any other person had ever had to ask themselves that question. But the cigarette ran out, and so did his intrusive thoughts. He didn't allow himself to brood for long. He couldn't slow down, not now. He had to keep going. Stopping for too long would drive him mad. And he couldn't sit around and wait for the year-walkers to get their shit together. It was easy enough to slip into the employees section of the hotel. They were understaffed and chronically bored, leaving Lloyd ample space to do whatever. He hurried past a changing room, where a young woman was talking on the phone, and down a set of spiral staircases. There was a basement level. The entrance had to be there. Now, this would be the one thing they were trying to hide. They wouldn't leave it out in the open, and they sure as hell wouldn't make a habit of leaving it unattended. There might be traps, or alarms. Hell, there might be armed guards, depending on how deeply entrenched this thing was. Lloyd had to be careful. He was pretty good at spotting things out of place. Not as good as some of the guys they brought in as consultants back in the day, but good enough to warrant a pay raise. It was a special technique, leaning into a combination of experience and instinct. It was a practiced thing. You could learn it, but some people were born different. Lloyd had a more seasoned approach, but every now and then, an instinct would tingle. That's what it did when he reached the boiler room. This thing was old enough to match the supposed bomb shelter. It wasn't in use, but they hadn't removed it either. It was still connected to a set of pipes. The thing was heavier than a bank vault, so it wasn't moving anytime soon. Lloyd checked the sides, finding nothing out of the ordinary. But maybe that was the point. It wasn't about seeing. He ran his hands over the surface of the boiler. A rough, rusted exterior. But when he reached the far left side, he felt something smooth. Something round and modern. He pushed down on it, hearing a click. The front of the boiler swung open like a door, having the hinges hidden on the inside. There was a hole in the floor, and a ladder leading down. Lloyd patted himself on the back. He listened a final time, making sure no one was following him, and continued downward, closing the boiler behind him. The air was stale and old. There was a smell of algae tickling his nostrils. Swamp water and something else. Drain cleaner. There were small safety lights still working along the foot of the wall, guiding him forward. His feet cast long, sharp shadows, and he could only see vague outlines as the path forked up ahead. He took a sharp left and faced a closed and sealed door. Lloyd put his hands on it and turned the wheel, hearing the decades-old mechanism slowly click. The door swung open, and Lloyd stepped inside. The shelter was a series of small rooms interconnected by bulkheads. There was about 2 inches of water floating around, with a thick layer of algae on top. The place was still furnished, but most of it had either fallen apart or rusted beyond use. Lloyd could hear running water. Looking down the leftmost corridor, he could see a crack in the ceiling. Water was pouring out. This had to be what caused the shelter to flood. A breach from a nearby storm drain, perhaps. There was a noise up ahead. Someone talking in a casual tone. "I don't know," a man said. "I'll try." Lloyd slowed down and stepped around the corner. There was just one voice, seemingly talking to himself. "Sure," the man continued. "I'll get the others." Feet sloshed through the water, and a man hurried out of the shelter. He passed just inches from Lloyd, but didn't spot him. Lloyd held his breath until the man disappeared around the corner, seemingly in a hurry. There wasn't much time. If he wanted confirmation, this was it. He rounded the corner, followed a corridor, and took a left. There was a door slightly ajar, with an eerie blue light coming from within. He poked the door open and looked inside. It was a small room, most likely an office or communication center. The back of the room had caved in, revealing an open space behind the outer walls. The light was coming from a battery-powered lamp that had been hung from the ceiling. In the middle of the room was a desk that had been converted into a makeshift altar, covered in a bright white tablecloth. There were portraits on it, pictures of people who worked at the hotel. Some of them had notes attached. "You mean everything to me," one note read. "I'll fight for you," read another. Lloyd sighed, putting one of the notes down. They all had a small scribble of a goblet in the corner, perhaps to signify some joint activity. There was no doubt about it. It was a Martian. "Man, you got them good," he muttered. "But I gotta admit, I don't see the point. You just like collecting people?" Something stirred in the space between the walls, something dark and glistening, something large enough for the pressure in the room to shift as it moved. "There was this one kid who said you looked like a pool noodle. That means you're big enough to reach all the way to the hotel. They must have fed you quite a lot for you to gain that mass." A frog-like eye peeked around the corner. Its size rivaled Lloyd's entire head. "I don't think you eat people. If I thought you did, I'd have come armed. But I do think you're out of your element. Are you waiting for a caretaker to pick you up, put you back in the ocean?" Something dark slithered out, pointing to a cup on the table. It was filled to the brim with a black substance. Lloyd shook his head. "Nice try," he said. "I don't need to drink it for you to talk to me. Come on." A viscous mass rolled out of the dark, large enough to cover the entire back wall. Lloyd had been more right than he'd imagined. The thing was massive. What the hell had they been feeding it? "You are unusual." The voice rolled like a rattlesnake. Lloyd couldn't see a mouth, and could only guess as to how big this thing really was. "Is that why you stick around?" "Because they feed you. I can leave. I suspected as much." The thing pushed itself a little further. One of its eyes extended out into the room by a tentacle, tracing a circle pattern in front of Lloyd like a bobbing owl. "Maybe it'd be for the best if you just left these people alone," Lloyd said. "What do you think?" He kept his eye on the tentacle, making sure not to give it an angle to strike. There were countermeasures to rid yourself of the poison that a Martian could inject, but the side effects were brutal. "I think not." There was a sound coming from down the hall. The secret door in the boiler room creaked back open. Lloyd counted at least 4 individual footsteps. "Look," Lloyd said, "I think we need to have a conversation. We can't have that with your posse busting down the door." "I do not need you." More people. They could probably hear the conversation by now. Lloyd looked back, making sure he'd closed the door behind him. "Listen. Not all people are as lost in the dark as these poor folk. I know things. Big things. Things that will affect you." Someone was shouting. They could definitely hear him. Lloyd pressed on. "Your kind lives here now. You have nowhere to go back to. And if I'm right about how the universe works, there is nowhere left to go once Io wakes up. I think we need to discuss this." This caught its attention. "You speak of Io." The door swung open as 2 waiters looked Lloyd dead in the eye. One of them raised a knife, while the other raised a meat mallet. More people joined the crowd, flooding into the shelter. Then, their eyes rolled back. The weapons fell from their hands. Lloyd let out a sigh, turning his full attention back to the creature. Of course, it had full control. Let us speak. Yeah, Lloyd panted. Let's do that. Something wrapped around his leg. In this light, it looked like a black pool noodle. Not here. Lloyd's world flipped upside down as he was pulled into the dark. He hit the water hard, getting a splash across his face. This thing wasn't taking it easy on him, or maybe it didn't know how frail people really are. It pulled him inside the wall and down a tunnel. Suddenly the ground gave way to a free fall, sucking air into Lloyd's stomach as he fell 9 feet, only to land on the buoyant surface of the Martian. It didn't stop or slow, leaving Lloyd desperate for air. It pulled him through a long concrete pipe and through a labyrinthian brick maze. Lloyd was thrown around like a lone sock in a washer, smacking against wall, floor and ceiling with complete abandon. The thought occurred to him that maybe this creature just forgot about him somewhere along the way. Then the pipe curled downward. This time Lloyd couldn't see the end of it. Long way down. What do you mean? There was no response. Instead, the creature held Lloyd close and fell face first into the dark depths, past the ground and the bedrock, and into complete darkness. The air in Lloyd's lungs ran out long before they reached the bottom. Maybe he was hallucinating. This wasn't just a hole in the ground. This was a fissure in the earth itself. It put pressure in his ears, like a flight on takeoff. Lloyd heard his heartbeat growing louder as they reached terminal velocity, a straight shot down into the impossible. There'd been so many things for him to consider, but his mind had been scrambled. The pressure shifted as the creature adjusted, arranging its arms like an arrow piercing downward. As they hit some kind of surface, Lloyd slipped out of the creature's grasp and plunged deep into black water. Disoriented, he tried to figure out what was up and down, blowing out a bubble to see which way it rose. Almost sucking down a lungful of water, Lloyd breached the surface, sucking up whatever air there was. Lloyd had been lucky. While the space was dark as night, he could feel sharp stalagmites growing out of the water. A couple feet to the left, and he'd have been impaled. Instead, he swam up to it and held on to it, trying to orient himself in this new area. While he couldn't see a thing, he could hear plenty. The echo of water droplets hitting the surface, waves crashing against the walls, a long groaning sound that gargled in his belly, telling him that this place was no stranger to cave-ins. Bit by bit, light awoke throughout the cave. Bioluminescent lichen coated the walls in a cold wintergreen glow. It was enormous, an underground lake stretching further than Lloyd could see. The water was coated with stalagmites reaching almost 20 feet out of the black water and were still nowhere near the hole in the ceiling that had brought him down there. The Martian rose out of the water, a mass of swarming black in an ink-like coat. It had a head slushing around in there, and it reminded him of an elongated eel. Lloyd paid close attention to the placing of its eyes. They were facing forward. That's a feature of a predator. "Where are we?" Lloyd gasped. "What is this?" "Home." Something moved in the water. Ripples rolled across the surface in an uneven pattern. Lloyd looked down, but the surface was too dark. In a way, he was thankful. If he knew what was down there, it might affect his composure. Lloyd was many things, but he wasn't unafraid. Could they have made a nest there? Had it always been there? Just how many of them could there be? "Why did you bring me here?" Lloyd asked. "We could have talked up there." More voices. Creatures rose from the depths, some larger, some smaller. Some were lean and thin, others massive and round. One of them looked like an 8-legged salamander. Another was little more than a single beach ball-sized eye covered in black flesh. They didn't speak, but they looked at one another and something happened. A smell. They were putting something into the air, like odours and taste. To someone like Lloyd, it was overwhelming. But to them, it was a public forum. If a picture can say 1,000 words, what can a perfectly stimulated taste and smell do? They moved and shook and waved. A couple of them snapped at one another like hungry animals. There were many of them, but Lloyd stopped counting after 12, distracted by something touching his leg. He looked down, only for something sharp to reach up. It grasped his mouth and nose, forcing a liquid straight into his airways. A cold shock rushed through his system and into his lungs. For a second, Lloyd thought they were going to enslave him, to toy with him. But as his eyes dimmed, a light turned on in the back of his mind. Some part of him could sense his body being pulled underwater, but another part of him didn't seem to care anymore. He held his breath for as long as he could, until he felt something peculiar. The waters around him dissolved, leaving him light as a feather. He felt something solid under his feet. There was a sound to his left. The clinking of glass. Wooden chairs dragged across a tiled floor. Chatter. Small talk. He opened his eyes to a golden ballroom. There were hundreds of people, all dressed in turn-of-the-century fineries. Men had greased their parted hair with pomade and styled their moustaches. Ladies had dressed in their widest gowns and perfumed wigs. Silver chandeliers hung above, and banners of golden goblets covered the grandiose walls. Waiters passed silently by, offering delicacies on silver platters. There was laughter. It sounded like they spoke French. But listening a little closer, it was no language that Lloyd had ever heard before. Whatever it was short and efficient. Someone tapped him his shoulder. He spun around to see a young man, a late teenager. His side-parted hair and clean-shaven face made him look even younger. He held out a hand. "Manfred," he said. "Sorry about the introduction. Glad you could make it." "There's no ballroom on the bottom of the ocean," Lloyd muttered. "You've pumped me full of drugs." "If reality is not to our liking, we prefer to substitute our own," Manfred smirked. "The first few of our shoal imprinted on this particular lifestyle, and we have imagined it like thus ever since." "This is what you think we are?" Lloyd asked. "Wigged-up aristocrats pigging out on hors d'oeuvres?" "My dear guest, if that's all you were, we'd have no quarrel with you. Sadly, you disappoint us." He patted me on the shoulder with an eager smile. "Come," he continued. "You need to meet someone." Lloyd was guided through the crowd. One by one they turned to him, giggling, judging his outfit. It was a curious choice to put him into a fancy ballroom, but to force him to keep his shoddy jacket and well-worn jeans. Swiping what looked like a goblet of wine from a passing tray, Lloyd sniffed a drink. A part of him knew it was dangerous to indulge. Many stories like that of ancient fae or trickster demons were based on very real creatures. It wouldn't surprise him if one of those creatures were the Martians. There was no telling what their offerings might do to him. As if reading his expression, Manfred smiled at him. "It's all representation," he said. "Gestures. Words. That wine? It's little more than pheromones. So I'm drinking your excretion," Lloyd sighed. "Wonderful. Call it what you will, but here and now it's a 95 Chateau des Tourelles. I thought it was all turn-of-the-century themed." "A theme, yes. Not a law." The man held out a goblet for Lloyd, and he took it. If he was screwed, he might as well indulge. He took a swig and nodded. "I'll be honest. I can't tell one wine from another. The sublime is wasted on you." Manfred laughed. Before he knew it, Lloyd was face to face with a trio of aristocrats. A man in his 70s, dressed like a distinguished admiral, an elegant young lady, in a bright floral dress with lily pad patterns, and finally a smiling young man with a peculiar French accent, dressed in a decorated uniform. Manfred stepped forward, gesturing to Lloyd. "This is the man who wished to speak," he said. "Please let me introduce." "We'll take it from here, Manfred dear," said the woman, holding out a hand. "Lady Anura, at your leisure." Lloyd shook her hand and introduced himself with a slight bow. She curtsied in return. The younger man introduced himself in turn. "Milou, a pleasure." The older man shook Lloyd's hand too, but lingered a little longer. His face never moved. "My name is unspeakable in your tongue," he said, "and I prefer not to diminish myself for your convenience. Perhaps I can call you Admiral." "Admiral?" the man considered. "One to be admired. You may." There was small talk about simple things. The Martians were really invested in this image they'd captured, talking about anything from gossip between imagined servants to decorations chosen for the entrance hall. At one point, Lady Anura showed Lloyd the window. There was an entire city outside. There were other shoals out there who'd painted pictures of their own. This was what their world looked like to them. It was a sensation handcrafted for over a century. Going from one building to another meant moving either throughout the cave or to another cave system entirely. It was fully possible that this stretched for miles underseas. A harsh voice snapped Lloyd out of his wonder. "Well?" He turned to face the Admiral. Lady Anura sunk back into the crowd. "I'm sure you know what's going on," Lloyd said. "You know about Io, about how things are coming to an end." "Of course," the Admiral said. "Why do you think we're throwing a party? So you've given up? Does one give up summer to make way for winter? We have gone through this song and dance. It'd be impertinent to resist. But after Io, there's nowhere left to go. There are no more homes, no more sanctuaries." The Admiral nodded, looking out the window, as was intended. "But what if it doesn't have to?" Lloyd asked. "What if there was a way to live?" The Admiral twirled his moustache and swiped a small dessert from a passing tray. "Lemon curd. Io is a lost daughter, aching to come home," he said. "Her family is waiting in the stars. She needs to leave us behind and bring herself and all others to paradise." "You believe there to be such a thing?" Lloyd asked. "You believe in heaven?" "I choose to believe that at the end of all things the universe is good and wishes us comfort. I have yet to be proven wrong." The Admiral leaned back against the wall, getting a piece of curd stuck in his moustache. "I thought you'd have more to say," he admitted. "Perhaps we overestimated you." "Then what of Hatchet?" Lloyd asked. "You know of their plans?" "I could care less for their feeble fabrications," the Admiral snorted. "Let them play. It's all sandcastles. They aim to kill Io, you know. They have a weapon." That caught the Admiral's attention. He raised an eyebrow. Lloyd continued. "I think they're preparing it. They have a drill site somewhere in Tomskog, Minnesota. Not sure what kind of weapon it is, but they've burned half their enterprise to the ground to manufacture it." "I am aware of the site," the Admiral admitted. "Lady Anura has kept an eye on it." "Then you know they're not about to let up any time soon. No matter our personal opinions, we can both agree that Io should not be killed." The Admiral finished his lemon curd, putting it back on a passing tray. The timing was impeccable. "You're being presumptuous," he scoffed. "But you are correct." The Admiral took Lloyd by the arm and gently led him through the room. Lloyd managed to snatch up a small piece of cake as he went. He'd never seen such a perfect mixture of peach and cream before. Not to mention the crust. Whatever these things were imagining, he could get used to it. Was this what it was like being their servant? The Admiral raised a glass, clinking it with a silver spoon. "Brothers, sisters, and children aplenty," he said, as the hall fell silent. "I have been informed of a developing situation in the borderlands." A murmur rose from the crowd as eyes fell upon Lloyd. "It seems there are those who wish to end the coming jubilation in tragedy. The lowlands are on a tour of conquest, aiming to murder our queen." A gasp. Someone dropped a glass, which a servant was quick to scoop up. "We are a people of words, of commune, sense, and fairness alike. We have made our homes in the forgotten depths from Alamein to Annam. While we've had our differences, we can all agree that the wheels of history must turn." The young Frenchman, Milou, raised a glass. "And turn they shall." A couple more voices joined him, echoing the sentiment. "So I ask you, my people, for a vote," the Admiral continued. "I ask for a voice to intervene, to stop another Kaiser." The hall erupted. There was no discourse, no dissenting voices. There was unity and fury. There was a gleam in their eyes that gave away the sheen of their illusion, showing a dark depth that only an ocean could match. The Admiral raised a glass. "Then we intervene, for Io." The hall responded in kind, for E-O, E-O, E-O. The sound echoed in Lloyd's mind as his vision shifted. He could feel a tug in his stomach as something moved, a push on his back, ejecting something from deep within him. The Admiral turned to him. "It is decided," he said. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention." "What's happening?" Lloyd trembled. His vision pulsed with black without him closing his eyes. He was waking up. He sank to the ballroom floor, feeling the exquisite tiles under his fingers. The Martians looked down at him curiously. Lady Anura waved at him. Strange, she only had 4 fingers on each hand. Adieu. And with that, Lloyd disappeared. A thought tickled him. Somewhere in the void between breaths, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd done the right thing. Was it right to involve these creatures? Did he even want to? After all, they wanted the world to end, albeit on its own terms. Or perhaps they weren't as uniform as they seemed. Lloyd woke up with a gasp. Half his face was covered in sand. He was lying on a beach, bathed in a distant sunrise. His mouth tasted like old ham and drain cleaner, sending a gargle through his body. He checked himself for damages, but concluded that he was fine. Looking around for a landmark, he noticed a warning sign. A yellow square with Force Currents and Rochers sous l'eau written underneath. Lloyd wiped his eyes. I'm in fucking France. Looking a little closer, he noticed something. There was a vertical line running through the sand, as if something had dragged itself out of the ocean. Something big. But it wasn't just one line, or two. There were hundreds,